every time I do the pasting, it does blank space next to tabs. I don't know why, but we are ready to go, Ruth.
Okay, all right. With my, here we go. Welcome everybody to our board meeting. Okay, so I'm going to pass for now on the leadership report. I may come back to it. Jean-Paul, do you want to do an executive director's report?
Just a couple of quick things related to the activities of the staff. We're still working to support the committees, and I really wanted to acknowledge all of the work of the state board staff during the times of COVID, but also especially the staffs of the Ombudsman and Student Advocate, who have been working incredibly tirelessly to make sure that our residents and our students and our families have access to their services. It has been a really challenging time for families, and knowing that they have a resource like the Ombudsman and Student Advocate really makes a difference. And so I just wanted to thank them publicly and in this forum for all of that work. But that's the only update I have, Madam President.
Well, and that's of course where we are starting today, is to hear the reports from them. So thank you for thanking them on behalf of the board members. Also, thanks. It really has been quite a year, and I am very interested in hearing sort of the way it has kind of affected all of your work and what you've been able to do and the kinds of problems and issues and obstacles that may be worse than they are now. So with that, so I guess first we'll hear from the Office of the Ombudsman, and then we can do some Q&A and then go to the Office of the Student Advocate. Good. All right. So with that, Serena Hayes.
That happened faster than I anticipated.
Oh,
no, it's okay. Yeah, just give me 1 second. Okay. I'm setting my timer so I stay on time. Okay. Thank you all really for being here and giving me an opportunity to share the work of the Office of the Ombudsman. I'm really excited to be here this evening. John Paul, can you push to slide 2? We're going to start off really by getting into the data from, again, this is data from last year. So all of this won't really touch on distance learning and what's been going on during COVID-19, but some of it will. As a start, you should see the yearly case comparison cases. So now we're on slide 3. In school year 2019-2020, we received about 139 contacts from stakeholders, and that turned into about 511 cases. And if you see the comparison between our numbers this past year and the year before, so 2018-2019, we're down about 100 cases. At the beginning of the year, we were trending upwards to exceed the 2018-2019 call volume as well as cases. And when we get to another graph later on, you'll see what happened and sort of when and why. I quickly want to, we can go to slide 4. I quickly want to summarize the demographic data. I didn't include a bunch of charts on the demographic data because really over the last 2 years and likely beyond, the data has been pretty consistent. So really we typically have a high percentage of DCPS cases versus charter. On the race and ethnicity piece, we typically see that we have an underrepresentation of Hispanic and Latinx communities and a slightly higher representation of African American communities. And our grade bands are fairly evenly distributed across elementary, middle, and high school. And that's the same for this year. Moving on, this past year, we embarked on a partnership with the Office of the Attorney General to provide mediation services as an intervention for families of students who are experiencing issues with school attendance. And the next slide, you'll see some of the barriers that the families that we worked with experienced. So for the year, we did about 26 mediations on behalf of the, or sort of in partnership with the Office of the Attorney General. And this 26 is not, we didn't count this towards our cases because I want to be really careful about not artificially inflating our numbers. But in the course of working with the families, we've really worked to identify some of the barriers that were preventing students from attending school regularly. And the idea is that the families would be sort of monitored, attendance would be tracked, and sort of making sure that they're connecting with the resources that we help, that we inform them about, to really help decrease or remove those barriers and improve attendance over a 90-day period. What we saw really was transportation was the highest or most frequent barrier identified, but special education, mental health, the mental health of students, as well as issues of homelessness were almost equally high. And on average, families identified about 3 barriers, when we met with them to discuss the challenges that they were experiencing getting their students to school regularly and on the time. Next, I want to shift a little bit into the trends that we saw over the year. And on slide 8, what you'll see is really a breakdown between 2 distinct time periods, one being before distance learning and the second being during distance learning. What I really want you to compare are the blue to the orange. And really what you see is how drastically our numbers went down once the school system shifted to distance learning in March. We went down across 7 of the 8 wards. Actually, we went slightly up in Ward 4, and I'm not sure why. On slide 9, we talk about or highlight some of the case topics. Again, this data is very consistent with what we saw last year. Communication and engagement, bullying, student safety, and special education are our top 3 issues. While communication and engagement was sort of the most frequent, it's also important to understand that really it rarely appeared as a single issue topic. So if a family had an issue with communication and engagement, it was often paired with something else. So next I want to talk a little bit about some of what we saw. Again, this is last year with COVID-19 cases. It was really important to me that we flag cases that were related to COVID. And how we define that is if the problem only existed or really was exacerbated because of distance learning. We had about 30 calls that were specifically related to COVID-19. Distinct from what we saw in the previous slide, some of the topics that were coming up more really was the academic progress, and really that was equal to special education. So by comparison, there were about 53% of our cases were academic progress cases, but pre-COVID, academic progress was only 15%. Communication, engagement, and special education were still consistently high, and then you see this huge drop off with bullying and student safety, I think for pretty obvious reasons. You all know I talk about special education all the time. I'm going to do that again and really parse out some of our data from last year about special education. So looking forward on, I think it's slide 12, our special education cases. Again, this is similar to last year. We had about 50% of our students that we had open cases for and worked with were students who were diagnosed with disability. And slide 13, what you see is the breakdown of where and when the problems really happen. And this looks at that whole timeline from when a family requests an evaluation through once the student actually now has the IEP and what that student is experiencing as a student with an IEP. And what we see is that most of the problems and most of the complaints that we're getting calls about really relate to after the student has an IEP. And some of those complaints look like concerns around behavior and discipline, IEP implementation, which is when maybe the IEP itself is very robust, but the student isn't actually getting the services consistently. Then we've identified issues that are that are problems with the IEP, right? So maybe it's the student who isn't making academic progress, or maybe the goals are not appropriately ambitious. There are also concerns with placement and location of service, transportation, and safety. On slide 14, we really, in part because we had a decrease in the call volume once COVID hit, I mean, we knew that it's difficult to ensure that students with disabilities are receiving all the services and supports that they need during the school year. So we were really concerned now that the education had shifted to a virtual platform, we wanted to know what families were experiencing. So we conducted a survey in the spring of 2020. We decided to narrow the survey. We decided to, oh, John Paul, that's okay. If you could go back one slide. Yeah, there we go. Okay. We decided to narrow the survey really to families that we had worked with in the past 2 years. We'd considered opening it up, but decided ultimately that we wanted to be able to speak with families over the phone in order to complete the survey. We didn't want the internet to be a barrier, and we were concerned that we wouldn't have the capacity to do that if we did open it up. So the full report for this is already up on our website. And actually, John Paul, I can send you the link if you wanted to send it out to everyone. That would be great. But the 3 questions that I want to highlight here that we asked within the survey were around satisfaction with communication, satisfaction with IEP implementation, and the last one was about compensatory education. So what we found with the families that we spoke with, that a lot of times we're actually really pleased with the consistency of communication from special education teachers and special ed coordinators. And I think the sort of the take-home message for us and really for the community at large is really, it seemed like if the only thing that schools could do was communicate proactively with families, they were doing that. On satisfaction with IEP implementation, what we found was ultimately that any family who indicated that they didn't have appropriate technological supports, that they were more likely to say that they were not at all satisfied or only partly satisfied with the IEP implementation during distance learning. Then here comes sort of the magic question that I think even now everybody is sort of like thinking about, at least in the back of their minds. And this is about compensatory education. So we really directly asked families whether they anticipated seeking comp ed based on their students' experience with distance learning. And what they said is anyone who reported that they were more than satisfied or very satisfied with the IEP implementation, of course, they were not likely to request comp ed. That's a kind of a no-brainer, it makes sense. But anyone who was either partially satisfied or not at all satisfied with the IEP implementation, it wasn't necessarily a determining factor as to whether they intended to seek compensatory education services. And I think to some extent this may speak to the grace that that families were giving to schools last school year. All right, so I want to go ahead and jump into our recommendations. And with these recommendations, I do want you to keep in mind that while, yes, COVID-19, we're still in the midst of dealing with a pandemic, our recommendations really speak to the work that we've done over the scope of the year, not just those last 3 months. Okay, so our first recommendation is about 504 plans. The basic problem is that 504 plans don't transfer with students when they go from one school to another. And what we've seen consistently from students is that once they lose that 504 plan and they don't have those accommodations, we start to see the regression, failing grades, discipline concerns. When we speak with the school, it's often that they were not aware that the student had a disability, or they were not aware of a previous 504 plan. And when we speak with the parents, parents are often unaware that the 504 plan didn't transfer. Our recommendation to that is to have 504 plans transfer with students when they matriculate from school to school. The hope here is that it would minimize the risk of disrupting that student's academic progress. And I think the other piece to this is like parents don't have to go through the whole process all over again. Our next recommendation pertains to something that y'all have definitely heard me talk a lot about, RTI, or response to intervention. The problem that we have seen, unfortunately, a very common trend that we've seen, is a practice of using response to intervention as a precursor to accessing evaluations for a child who's suspected of having a disability. So what does that look like? That looks like a parent who says, I have some concerns about my child's academic performance. I think there maybe there's something going on, and I'm concerned that that it may be a deeper issue. And the school's response is, okay, well, we can put them your student in an intervention program without necessarily informing that parent about the option to potentially do an evaluation for a disability. It's pretty clear that the Office of Special Education Programs has explicitly stated that RTI should not be used to delay or deny an evaluation. Once we sort of started to dig a little bit more into these cases, we realized that DCPS has a policy, and it's called Determining If K-12 Students Need Special Education, that the wording of the policy sort of implicitly suggests that RTI has to be, I want to say exacerbated. No, that's the wrong word. That you have to go through the RTI system like completely and use exhausted. Thank you. Like the word is exhausted. Sorry. They have to go through RTI and exhaust the interventions in RTI in order to get or receive an evaluation. And it's just not true. So our recommendation is really specific to DCPS and specific to this policy, and that the recommendation is that policy needs to be reworked and reworded in order to conform to the OSEP, OSEP guidance. Following any policy revision, we do believe that teachers and administrators need to be trained. And I think this also connects to our recommendation from last year on developing that RTI framework, and this piece around being really clear to parents that RTI doesn't take the place of an evaluation. So our next recommendation is about the overall approach to special education. And one of the things that we see, because we work with so many different schools across the city, is that there are a lot of differences in the information that a special ed coordinator will share with families. And this is particularly true for our families whose students fall under the other health impairment IDEA classification. I want to give like an example of a student perhaps who has ADHD. ADHD is it's a diagnosis. And when you look at the IDEA classifications, it would fall under the other health impairment. So other health impairment itself is just a classification. It's not a diagnosis. Sometimes when we speak with parents, they don't know that there are actually additional resources that could help support their students' educational needs. And that, like in part, right, an example is really a conversation with your child's pediatrician. And a lot of times, like the families don't understand or know, because nobody told them, that the other health impairment, that really the diagnosis may likely be ADHD, right? Our recommendation for this is really to encourage schools to have a more holistic approach to special education. And this is especially true in the early stages, right? To make sure that schools are developing language in collaboration with medical professionals to explain the types of disabilities that children are diagnosed with. particularly again, when we're talking about other health impairment. We also believe that it's important to offer resources and suggestions for next steps beyond what can necessarily be provided within like the school or within an IEP. And the point here is that we're not trying to push parents necessarily towards medicating students, but we want parents to have the information that they need to best support their students and make informed decisions. I mean, if you don't know that an IEP is not treatment for your child, there are going to be a whole lot of questions that you still have as a parent, especially if that IEP doesn't seem to be working. The last recommendation that I'm going to highlight here is really about student records. And I think that this is a common problem that we see both it's like as an agency, we get, I know SBOE gets a lot of complaints about this, as well as OSA. And although our office doesn't have a high population of adult callers, when adults call, they're usually calling about their student records. The biggest problem that we are seeing is that a lot of records can't be found. Older records can't be found. So students aren't able to access those records. And they need them, right? For things like seeking employment, obtaining a state issued identification card. And when they're not able to obtain those records, a lot of times they become disqualified for grant funded career programs. We've seen people have job offers and promotions rescinded. Sometimes people have had to repeat college courses that they had taken in high school. So really the recommendation here is pretty straightforward, and it is to develop a plan to digitize archive student records, just to make them a lot more accessible. And in cases where those records can't be found, students will know that a little bit more quickly. The reality is record keeping is never going to be a sexy issue. And yet it has a tremendous value for adults who, attend and graduated from our city's public schools. And it really does present an equity issue because many people who are looking for those records are also people who likely don't have a degree from an institution of higher learning. And now I'd like to open it up for questions.
Karen?
Okay,
You're on.
Okay. Good to see you again. I just wanted to know, you were talking about homelessness. How many homeless children have you run across? And after that number, how have you helped them become home or have a place to live or is that something that you're doing now?
So yes, we did talk about homelessness being a barrier to attendance, and the cases where we knew that families were experiencing homelessness were related to the partnership with the Office of the Attorney General for the attend mediations. Okay. And what we do, in those cases is, we flag homelessness as an issue, and then we can try to connect the families with the resources that will both help with the homelessness, right? So that, like, for example, the Mayor's Services Liaison Office, like a lot of times they'll give vouchers to families, housing vouchers to families. So that may be a resource that a family who says that they're homeless receives. In some cases, the family may or may not be looking for the housing voucher as a resource. Like they may be homeless, but still like living with family. And maybe in that case, they might want the Kids Ride Free cards, right? So then that would be like a type of resource that we would help connect them with. So it really depends on how the family articulates their the barrier and the need. For our cases that are strictly from the Office of the Ombudsman, we don't track unless it is like it comes up in our conversations with families. That's not a question that we ask for several different reasons, but mostly because our intake process is already very extensive. And sometimes families really just, they want to be helped. And if they don't understand, you know, all the precursors that we have to like ask or clear through before we even get to them talking about why they called our office, it can be a very frustrating experience for them. So we opted not to ask those questions.
Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Parker.
Thanks for sharing, Serena. And as always, it's great to see you. I'm going to just, I have like 2 or 3 questions. I'm going to share them and then you can tackle them all at once if that would be helpful. You shared a graph where you reflected on how calls shifted upward, I believe, when schools transitioned to COVID or distance learning during COVID. The question I had was on the next slide, it seemed like you were suggesting that only 27% of families were not satisfied with the implementation of their IEP. And I would have assumed that number would have been a lot higher because a lot of the feedback that we were hearing is that schools, some weren't able to service students. And so do you know if, like, what is the timeline of that figure, that 27%, and did that shift as schools transition to distance learning? The second question, you talked about the using RTI as a precursor during evaluations, specifically in DCPS. And this is just a general process question. Have you shared that feedback to DCPS? Would it be helpful for like the state board leadership to communicate that? Because it seems like that would be an easy thing to change, I would imagine. And then third, in terms of the student records, like who are you or who do you imagine would own or manage that? Would that be an OSSI type of initiative, or would LEAs manage these digital records individually, are you thinking? And the reason why I asked that is also thinking about like next steps. That too seemed like a very practical solution. And so like, how can we operationalize that? And then I just didn't know if you thought that was OSSI or individual LEAs.
Okay, so I'm going to try to hit all 4. Hopefully I remember all 4. Thank you. The first, I'm going to go in order. So the graph on the call shifting during distance learning, it was a downward trend for us. So we got fewer, much fewer. And this is sort of a similar issue to what CFSA experienced, to what sort of our other similarly aligned offices, right? Like experienced this decrease in this, in the beginning, it was almost like eerie, like silence from families once there was that drastic shift to distance learning. On the implementation of the IEP piece, and I think you said it was the 27% like that said
that they were not
satisfied. And you said that you thought that that number would be a lot higher. So first, let me offer the caveat that the survey was done in April. And this piece around like not satisfied doesn't necessarily mean that they received services.
Gotcha.
Right. Okay.
I think like there's 2 caveats. One is like whoever completed the survey, and then 2, who's ever calling your office.
Right. But then the other piece that I want to stress, like what we noticed, and I do encourage you to take a look at the full slide deck on that survey. I think what we saw at that time is a lot of families had grace, like a lot of grace and a lot of understanding for schools in that season, right? And then the question was like, how long is that going to last? And I think that when I give my annual report next year, it's gonna look different. Right, because we're in this situation a lot longer than I think anyone really expected. So keep that in mind. Then you asked about the RTI, and yes, I value relationships very much, and I don't know that I would ever publicly say something that I haven't disclosed to the LEA before, especially if I'm going to name it, right? So this issue actually came up we noticed it sort of relatively early in the year, and we did speak with DCPS, and they were open to looking into it. And I think really COVID happened, and everyone's energy shifted elsewhere. And then on the student records piece, so who would manage the full process? I envisioned it happening more so at the LEA level. I think that one of the things that I've noticed within really the last year or so, that there seems to be a lot more well, I don't want to say a lot, but there has been a lot of collaborating between DCPS, PCSB, and OSSE. And I think I'm open to leaving it up to them to decide how they want to do that. But I imagined it happening at the LEA level, and perhaps with some support from OSSE. I think I got them all. Okay.
You got them all. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. O'Leary.
Yes. Hey, Serena. Thank you so much for your presentation. I have a couple of short questions, I think. The first is, when you were talking about the numbers for special ed, what about ELL? And how are the problems that you've been getting from students who are in the ELL universe on the virtual learning?
Yeah, I think of the full spectrum. Like, we are missing our families who don't speak English as a native language. We're missing them.
Why is
and
that?
When I first, so I don't know, honestly. I don't know. I mean, we did last year. I don't know if you recall my testimony for, I think it was performance oversight, where I really talked about like the financial investment that we have made in trying to get more Hispanic and Latinx families to reach out to the office. Even with staffing, I prioritized hiring a Spanish speaker, a fluent Spanish speaker. She's also a certified translator. We made the investments, and we haven't done it. Apparently it hasn't been enough. And I think that particularly given the size of our office, we don't necessarily have the capacity to go to every single event. We just don't. And I think a part of what we may need to do is find organizations that are already connected, and find other people who are already connected to the ELL community who can essentially vouch for us. And that hasn't happened yet. And this isn't like, I'm not trying to ignore the issue. I didn't highlight it in our annual report, one, because I only have 20 minutes to present, but it's a huge weakness. And I would like to fix it. And right now I'm not sure how.
Thank you. When you sent the survey, how did you send the survey? Online?
We called.
Okay.
We made a whole lot of phone calls. Mm-hmm.
Okay, good. Thank you. All right, I'll put them in the chat too, the rest of them, because I don't want to take up anybody else's time. Thank you. Thank you, Serena.
You're very welcome.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Dr. Sutter.
Thank you. Thank you, Serena. Really appreciated this year's annual report. I had 3 questions. One is about the RTI framework that you recommended last year. And I just wondered, was there any movement on that? Did you ever hear anything back? Is there anything else we can do to continue getting that recommendation some attention?
Actually, yes. I'm really excited. I'm glad that you asked me this question. There has been traction. I'm sure that you all are aware that OSSE has really been focusing on special education and really improving educational outcomes for students with disabilities. And recently they released they moved out of sort of the landscaping phase and moved into the strategic plan phase and kind of outlined sort of what their responsibilities were going to be and what initiatives they were going to take on. And one of the initiatives is creating a multi-tiered educational system and structure, right? It deals with exactly what RTI talks about. And they're going to do it for academics, social and emotional learning. And I think the other one was mental health. So I'm very excited that it's happening, and I'm not sure exactly what the timeline for that is going to be, but it's happening.
Awesome. That is great to hear. And I am excited to follow that process at OSSE. I'm very glad that that is getting traction. The second question is around student records. During my work with PCSB and the closure of schools, that often became an issue. I know that PCSB is in the law supposed to remain the sort of holder of records in ad infinitum, and they scan them, digitize them. But who do you think is the right entity for that? Is that something that would ideally sit with the OSSE? Is it something that would sit with the board? Is it something that should sit with DCPS and the charter LEAs separately?
It's an interesting question, and I'm not sure. I have found that I think if we were talking about a system where everyone is working together, then I think it may not matter quite as much, like who houses the project. I think that what we see on the sort of state board side as an agency is that people seem to come here first for their records, and they don't really know where to go. So to me, the who manages it is less important than messaging where families can go to get the information. And yeah.
Got it. That's helpful. My last question is, given the calls you got during COVID, you mentioned around academic progress and communications and special ed, are there any insights you would offer to us for the discussion we're having later in the meeting around reopening and the kinds of challenges that families have called in needing help addressing?
I would say this as not necessarily for last year's annual report. I would say for what we're seeing now.
Yeah.
Is that that grace period is gone.
Okay.
And that families are at their wit's end. And they really feel abandoned when it comes to the supports and services that their students really need. And the delivery, even through virtual instruction for many families, is just not, for many kids, it's not working. And while all of that is true, there are still a lot of families who are not ready to send their kids back, and they're scared. And what families really, right? There's a mix, right? Like not everyone thinks the same way or wants the same thing. And so I think it's important to see like the full spectrum, right? And really with our parents who don't want to send kids back, what they're looking for is more of a hybrid approach and bringing someone into the home. That's really what they want. Yeah.
That's really helpful. Thank you so much, Serena. I really appreciate that. Thank you, John Paul.
Thank you. Are there additional questions before I go with to the president? Cool. President Wattenberg.
Hello, thank you. That was very interesting. The whole issue of the RTI and the MTSS, I have really a lot of questions about, and not the time to do it here. And I want to sort of think with you about how we might come back to that and how it may or may not be helped or affected by the new legislation adopted by the council around dyslexia. So I just want to say a bunch of questions there. Because it's a huge issue, obviously. Put them aside for the moment and focus on two things that I think they're so specific, they're so concrete, and others have sort of talked about them, but I want to see if we can figure out what we can do. I mean, one is this, the transfer of the automatic transfer of the 504. I mean, and people have touched on it, but I mean, is that something we want OSSI to do? Is it something that the LEAs have to do? Did you say that was the one that the LEAs you thought should be doing? I mean, that the requirement should be on them?
So, how do I say this? So for the 504 plan specifically, my understanding is that OSSI has been in the process of sort of undergoing their data systems and creating space for modifications. So it could be that it could be that, you know, the data systems would now allow for 504 plans to transfer. My thought is that at the end of the day, like the regulation for this should come at the OSSI level potentially, but that it would be for there to be a data system that would allow the tracking and the transfer of the 504 plans from school to school, and become a part of the students' records.
And is that the one, I'm sorry, some of the things were getting mixed up in my mind because my audio was in and out. Is that the one, is that the issue that you said or that DCPS was getting very involved in? And
no, the issue that I said that we had discussed with DCPS was around the RTI policy revision.
All right. So going back, I mean, so on the automatic transfer of the IEPs, so that is something that we could take up.
The automatic transfer.
I mean, of the 504s, I'm sorry, the automatic transfer of the 504s, that is something that we could take up with OSSI.
I mean, I want to stress that a part of the work of the office is to have those conversations. So we've talked to OSSI about the 504 plans. We've talked to DCPS about their policy that impacts RTI and evaluations, and lending a voice to the conversation, you know, is helpful, you know, as well, and it's also integrated in the work.
So you want to continue leading that discussion. I mean, so I guess what I'm trying to figure out is on those two things, the automatic transfer of the 504 and the digitization, well, do them separately. They're very concrete. What could we do to help make that happen? Or do you think it can happen sort of in the next year given current processes? Or is there?
I think in terms of a timeline for, particularly for, let's look at the digitization records piece. I don't know how much that would cost, right? Like, I do think that there has to be, well, I'll say it this way. So with our office, when we do case management, we start at, I don't want to say the lowest level, but like we'll start with working with the school first, like at the school level. If we don't get a response from the school, we're going to the instructional superintendent, and we keep working our way up. And for us, like we're, you know, in initial conversations around moving some of this stuff forward. And I think the question is like, at what point do we need to add additional voices into the space? And I'm not sure like 100% that we're there yet. I can say that where my office really needs help right now, like 100% we need help. But when you are reaching out to your communities and you're going to your events, like talking about our office and letting people know that we're still here, because we're still not seeing the volume that we want to see. So those are huge issues. Elevating the annual report, highlighting the issues. Yeah. Do we want you to tweet about and, you know, post on social media the recommendations that are coming into that are coming out of the annual report? Absolutely. And I think in terms of like discussing like sort of next steps on like a deeper collaboration around some of these issues, like I'm happy to like continue to have those conversations. I'm just not sure that that I think that they need to happen like today. I guess.
Okay, I mean, I guess what I think is those are just two issues that our kids would be really well served by having done. So if there's a way we can help you, and it sounds like that's not what you're asking for right now, I think that would be a good thing for us to take up, but we'll leave that for now. So we can move on. Thank you. It was very informative.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Serena. I really appreciate it. I did want to also just give a little more context on the records piece, if you don't mind, from the state board side. So we have the state board in the first 10 months of 2020 have received 190 calls that we've tracked based only on for records requests. Of those, 30 were related to unsuccessful attempts at getting the records, and that the 190 represents about 30% of all of the calls that we've received in this first 10 months. And it is something that is very frustrating for individual students and for also folks who are, seeking jobs and seeking additional college or going, whatever they need it for, which is frankly none of our business. They have rights to they should have access to their records. And I think one of the things too that we might consider is talking with the archivist and talking with them about how to use their systems of digitization. Is that the right word? I think maybe for these types of things. And it does get complicated, right? There are lots and lots of records. But it also can be done. I mean, it could be done in partnership. The University of Maryland has a really, really strong records and archiving program. There could be partnerships there. There could be partnerships with I'm losing my train of thought, but the school on 16th Street, Jack, help me, the name of it. That's the records place for the old board.
Columbia. Oh, yeah, Franklin School.
Yes, but the other one that's also up the road further. Anyway, I'll think of it.
Columbia Heights Education Campus?
No, it's anyway, it's there on like 16th and R, I think it is. Anyway, prior to COVID, we had scheduled a trip for the state board staff to go look at all the old archives for the old Board of Education, and it's completely escaping my brain right now, but they do have a lot of archiving.
This is Sumner
School. Thank you. Yes, the Sumner School. I knew there was a thing. Anyway,
17th Street.
Yeah, but I agree with Serena. I think too, and Dan certainly gets some of the calls that are super challenging in terms of being able to get access to the records. But it's something that it's like you said, it's not a exciting thing, but it is something that could really give value for the money for that to be accessed. So sorry, Serena, I'll let you get the last word if you want, or I'll turn it over to Dan for his presentation.
No need, turn it over to Dan.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Hey, Dan.
Hi, guys.
Hey, guys.
Hey. Thank you guys for providing me to present our annual report this year. On our next slide, I'm kind of going to talk about what we do and kind of what we've done this past year. And then we'll get into our data. So what we do every year is we operate our hotline and request for assistance. It's manned alive. We really, we pride ourselves on making sure we're getting families moving through their issue and their situation. In addition to that, we do a ton of events, ton of engagement. We're always out in the community. And, as always, if you guys have things that are going on in your ward or going on with your schools, please let us know, and we love to show up, even virtually. On to the next slide. Yeah. So our annual report this year, we're going to talk about our whole year data. We'll talk a little bit about some of our COVID data and some of the activities and inputs that we did throughout this year before COVID hit and distance learning hit, and after distance learning hit in response to some of those activities, in response to supporting families.
Dan, I apologize for interrupting. Can you get a little closer to the microphone? We're having a little trouble hearing you.
I hate this computer. Can you guys hear me now?
Yes, thank you.
I'm sorry, my head will be very big for the remainder of this presentation. Yeah, next slide. Yeah, we can keep it going. So one of the things that we spend a lot of time, and you always hear me talking about this, is around student safety and safe passage. And particularly, we're really in this space where we want to build parent capacity, school leadership capacity, and community capacity to really solve this issue. And so we do that through a whole bunch of different ways, mainly through having a lot of community conversations and really trying to get those ideas and synthesize those ideas into actual policies and practices. And so we've done these conversations in Ward 8 for the past 2 years. We've done these conversations this past year, Ward 4, 5, and 7, and we've made some headways and we've done a lot of things. And so several of the things that have come out of those conversations are, one, our Safe Spots initiative. Two, we did a pilot of the Congress Heights Walking School Bus, and we also did a student safety needs assessment. Next slide. So one of the main things that we talked about is around safe spots. And so safe spots are businesses, community-based organizations, government entities, places that are in communities along our high targeted areas where multiple school communities are having students travel to and from are using. And so we located businesses, we located organizations, and they've stepped up to the plate to volunteer staff time and their time and open up their space to be safe spots and allow essentially students to come into their space when there's an issue, a challenge, concern, or for whatever reason, they can come to the space and have some respite. And on the business side, the ask is, one, either connect that student back to the school, connect that student to emergency services needed, or dial 911 in the instance that it's, it has escalated to that place. Next slide. And so in Congress Heights, we're continuing to find community power and buying power. And so what we had in Congress Heights was one of our charter partners, Congress Heights Center City, which was doing a really good job with their walking school bus, and they were relying on staff to make this go. And if you're familiar with that part of Ward 8 in Congress Heights, in that community there's around 6 or 7 other different campuses. So there's King Elementary, Blue State, Friendship, and several other bus routes that students are getting on and getting off through that intersection in moving. And part of what Congress Heights and the cities was doing was relying on the staff to kind of create more adult presence. So they had their staff, scattered throughout that neighborhood, different waypoints to, one, encourage the students to keep on moving, encourage other students to keep on moving, but also to kind of also coordinate with the other schools and their students to keep those students moving and keep everyone as safe as possible. Part of the challenge was making sure of having enough adults to do that. So our office came in, as well as several other folks came in to support that and augment that. And for us, one of the challenges is how do you get organizational stakeholders to buy in? Volunteering, getting parents to volunteer, and one of adults to volunteer is great, but sometimes it doesn't give folks enough capacity, enough reliability to really kind of stand up programs and have those programs moving forward. And for us, being an entity there where we had some staff capacity, we were able to kind of pilot what that would look like for any entity or any organization. And so essentially we did was we volunteered on Mondays, and essentially it was one of our staffers every Monday was going out to Congress Heights to either help man a spot or walk with students to the next location. And then in addition to that, as well as help that school kind of recruit other organizations that could kind of step up and fill in those other days. And so we did that for that past year, and it was something that's worked out. And out of that time, we spent maybe probably 100 some odd staff hours committed to this project, with no more than each staff person contributing around 10 to 15 hours. And so it was just a great mix of being able to have create capacity for this community, to get more capacity from other stakeholders involved into the community, and 3, really was a solution that doesn't require a lot of upfront capital costs. And so we were able to do that now. And what we're doing now with the DME and the leadership from Congress City Heights is creating PDs and trainings for other schools to replicate this model, and so they can add this to their toolkit for their safe passage program. Next slide. This past year, one of the things that we did right before COVID was conduct a survey of students. And so we did a survey we surveyed around 430 students that attend around 15 DCPS schools and another 12 charter schools. And we did these surveys through an online portal, Question Pro. And we asked them really about, what was safe about their route, what wasn't safe about the route getting to from school, when and where and how. And so we were really trying to dig down and see like what are the things that students are experiencing going to and from school. In addition to the surveys, we also hosted around 15 or so focus group during the month of March and a little into April, via April. And we came around with a couple of key themes, and these themes also, explained a little bit more in depth in our report. But one of the things that students, in all wards at all schools, they all kind of found around found a level of not being safe or unsafe around unknown people that are interacting with them or entering their space during their travel to and from school. Multiple incidents of street harassment. Some exhibited some PTSD with a very strong need to be hypervigilant. One of the things that we saw as a protective factor was, students, noting that they're traveling in groups and using that as a means for protection. And the other thing that was kind of true throughout was this prevalence of uncertainty about just feeling unsafe, that anything could happen anywhere and that there was nowhere that was necessarily, they were safe and protected. On to the next. I'm sorry, if you can go back. So we took all this information and we actually partnered with the Urban Institute to kind of actualize this report. And so we have all these findings. Some of those findings, again, are in our annual report, as well as we'll be releasing probably in the next week a finalized report that will have more detailed safe passage recommendations, as well as kind of more details around the students' views and students' feelings. Next slide. So again, as always, one of the things that we always talk about is supporting students with disabilities. This year we did two major efforts of trying to support those students. One is we repurposed our kind of Know Your Rights student workshop, the workshop and series that we've been doing for a while now, to really kind of focus on school choice and helping families navigate that process. The other thing that we did was come up with a guide for students or families that are dealing with or suspecting to be dealing with dyslexia. On to the next. So we hosted a Know Your Rights special education workshop, as well as put up the deck online. But it's really, we're really trying to create tools and really trying to create tools and guides that can help families navigate that process of choosing a school that's right for them, for their student if their student had a disability. And part of that problem was, I think Serena alluded to it, was just families not knowing what they're getting with what they're signing up for schools. And so we really try to we created a guidebook and created some tools that were able to, one, direct families to ask, the questions that will get them the answer that they need for their student. And then two, give them more tools and more information on how to navigate that process and navigate the LEAs that they do choose. On to next. The next thing we produced was we partnered with Decode Dyslexia DC, and we developed a DC-centric guidebook on kind of navigating dyslexia and navigating the processes and LEAs in our city on trying to get help. And so it's a great guidebook. It's meant to live online, and it goes through everything from providing families with terminology, so when they are sitting down at the table that they are using the correct terminology and understanding the terminology that is given back to them. There provides a whole bunch of information on national resources, things that they can take to do at home as far as home assessments, as well as kind of lays out common myths and facts. And so it tries to just get back to straight up, here's the truth, here's how to move forward. On to the next. One of the things that we did move into, one of the things that we've heard us talk about in the past is teacher representation. So we finally were able to launch our My Teacher DC website. And so the website is live, it's active now, myteacher.dc.gov. It's really a tool for families kind of navigating school choice again. It's a tool that allows families to say, okay, here are the issues that I think that are important for me. And it gives out information that's broken down by race, by gender, gives a breakdown of like who are questions to ask about the adults in the building, gives a lot of tools for parents to kind of navigate that process to make sure that they're matching their students in buildings that have adults that look like their students. On to the next. The last thing one of the other things that we've been doing, I think last year, we spoke a lot around student discipline. And one of the things that we went further down the rabbit hole in student discipline and kind of came away with part of the reason why we think teacher representation is so important is that when we have students and adults in the building that have shared history, that have shared culture, we see those decreases in discipline data for exclusionary practices. We see performances increase for academic wise. We see there's some raw positives that are just correlated with one another. And part of what we've been doing is trying to find ways to figure out how do we create a pipeline where we have more students that are coming from DC to stay in DC and become our teachers. Part of that was, tapping into our dual enrollment programs. DC, we have a great dual enrollment framework. We have several local universities and colleges that are already actively engaged and participating in dual enrollment. And it's a great pathway just in general. And so for us, it was like, okay, how can we put some intentionality on this pathway? And so we're beginning to have conversations with several of the dual enrollment program partners, universities that have school events. And so what essentially our ask is for students that are entering dual enrollment, that they, that entering dual enrollment program at a local university that has a school event, that they are linked into opportunities to take teacher prep classes. So opportunities to take classes if you're at AU and you're in their school event if you're at AU and they're in their dual enrollment program, the classes that you are offered are in line with the school event program. So AU is actually moving forward with that and are actively recruiting dual enrollment students that are looking to become teachers and enroll in their school event programs. Howard University, BOE, and Trinity are all also active in looking to increase DC students in return to DC classrooms as teacher, and their programs are on various different stages of development. Some are up and running, some are focusing on early childhood credentials, and others are more so focused on developing pathways for teacher representation around people that are coming from non-traditional backgrounds, non-traditional academic backgrounds. On to the next. The other thing that we focused on is around on student mental health and family mental health. Part of the reason why we decided to provide a lot more resource and capacity towards students' mental health and family mental health is the DBH recently started to move forward with their school-based mental health expansion, and we began to receive calls from families around that are getting calls or getting referred to the program with not necessarily understanding what the program is, what it means to have their student enrolled into a mental health initiative, what stigma is associated with that. And so we really took a step back and said, okay, what can we do to kind of know that this is something that we've been asking for, that this is a net positive, and how can we engage with our community? So we began our Don't Mute Mental Health podcast, and essentially our Don't Mute Mental Health podcast is a bi-weekly series of conversations that we have with students, teachers, mental health clinicians, stakeholders around what the health expansion is, kind of what their role is in that expansion, and how families are going to be engaged and what it meant for them as a student to be engaged. On to the next. So as we were doing this adult mental health, COVID hit, and part of our challenge with COVID was everyone was experiencing this trauma. A loss of not going to school every day, a loss of not being able to go outside, and all of the actual loss of people, moving on and transitioning away. And so we noticed that there was a lot of conversations and there was a lot of press conferences, and everything was very much geared towards adults, and nothing was necessarily geared towards students. And no one was talking to students around what's happening right now as far as COVID and what it would be. And so we partnered with the whole slew of our partner agencies and sister agencies, as well as several hospitals and several CBOs, to kind of talk about what COVID-19 is, how to maintain your mental wellness as a young person, balancing school then in a virtual environment with home responsibilities, maintaining healthy lifestyles, and as well as talking to parents around how they can support their students who they deem talking to parents with supporting parents. I'm struggling with this right now. Talking to parents as they are supporting students that they deem may be experiencing mental health challenges, as well as having a session on teacher wellness. Next slide. We also launched our Race, Equity, and Inclusion Toolkit website. Again, this is a website program we've talked about before in the past, but we're finally able to actually launch the website. And it's a live website, reitoolkit.dc.gov, and it's a great tool that offers a lot of reading, a lot of information, and kind of tools to have a conversation around race and equity in our current environment. I think this past year we all saw the challenges our society currently has with race, and part of that is part of us all seeing it is our students seeing that as well, and to move on without actually having conversations about race and having conversations about what that means in our school communities is an injustice. And so this toolkit that we have, this website that we have, creates tools and creates a safe space for families to begin to have those conversations, either in their living rooms or at their classrooms when it's welcome, or wherever when they're ready to have these conversations. On to the next. And again, we continue to put out our Family and Go-To Guide. We added several more resources this year. We added additional resources for homeless students, specifically for students that are unaccompanied, students that are not necessarily attached with families. We also added resources for families that are going through the bullying process, families that are, again, experiencing some mental health that need some mental health support, and military families that are coming to the district and need help navigating our school system process. Next slide. So into our data. So we're going to talk about two types of data: our RFA data, which is our main source of data. These are the calls that we get daily, and our outreach and engagement data, the data that we take from our activities where we're engaging the community. Okay, next slide. So there are four main categories. We have 12 categories for our RFA. Enrollment, access, special ed, student safety, and academic instructions are the four categories that have traditionally led our work. But there are again 8 other categories that we capture our data in, and 21 different subcategories that are correlated to those categories. Next slide. So we look at our school year 2019-20 data. We were initially on pace to outpass our data for pre-COVID. Then March 13th hit, and we definitely saw a slowdown. So we are like in Busman's office and like the other similar offices, we definitely saw a substantial decrease in calls to our office. A lot of things that we normally would experience during that time, during Q3 and Q4, just didn't occur. Next slide. So when we look at our numbers by grade band, you see a fairly even distribution, kind of representative distribution of what we would expect for where our calls will come from. And again, the top areas concerned by grade band for the most part are similar, just in different order depending on the grade band. Next slide. So our topic areas, and this is where our whole universe of calls for the full year. Again, special ed was by far the primary call, the primary reason folks called our office. Enrollment access was the second reason folks called our office. And student safety was our third reason why folks called our office. Student safety compared to previous years is substantially lower. Next slide. So we looked at our special ed, when we looked at the university of our special ed calls, 40% of those calls were related to IEPs. So families that are having issues specifically with that IEP. Another 18% of those calls were related to special ed placement. And the other issues were, transportation and questions around the 504 plan. And lastly, there was not enough support provided. And generally, not enough support provided is around technical assistance with them implementing an IEP. Next slide. So we looked at enrollment access and we dug into enrollment access. Transfer requests and the school choice My School process were the two leading categories that rounded out the top 5. That was shortly followed up with pre-K 3, pre-K 4 enrollment with special ed placement and graduation promotion. Special ed placement is one of those unique things that follow in our enrollment access. We kind of alluded to that a little bit earlier. We were talking about how families were navigating school choice and needing support for where their student is enrolling. And so, those calls generally take up a substantial amount of time to get resolved. On to the next slide. Student safety, again, in the subcategories that showed up the most were transfer requests, issues around bullying, not enough support provided, and transportation, as well as IEP. One of the things that we kind of saw a fall off dramatically since COVID happened this year and this current school year and this past school year is an incidence of bullying. There's, the virtual classroom has very much dwindled the need or request for support with bullying incidents. On to the next. So when we look at our RFAs and where they come from or what's necessary school buildings they come from, DCPS, again, is still leading us at around 70%. Most of the calls are still occurring from people that are choosing DCPS in their in-boundary, their neighborhood school. The other half of DCPS calls are coming from families that are choosing their out-of-boundary school, with our selective schools making a small, sub 4%, representation in our sector by RFA. Next slide. And so when we look at the breakdown by our in-boundary, enrollment access for students that are going to DCPS in-boundary schools, it continues to be an issue. One of the challenges with enrollment access for DCPS in-boundary usually is dealing with students that are PK3 and PK4 involved, and not necessarily getting the slot that they wanted to when they thought they were getting the slot they wanted to when they thought they were going to get it. For our out-of-boundary for DCPS schools, special ed is definitely is leading that challenge, and special ed, there's a whole gamut of concerns and issues that are associated with that. And for our selective and citywide schools, there was additionally around 23% were resource needs. And when we talk about resource need for a selective school, we're talking about a much more technical technical request. So I think we got a lot of calls regarding around transportation and busing and shuttle services. On to the next. When we look at our public charter schools, when we look at that, and we did that by in ward and students that are also attending their charter school that they're going to out of ward. Special ed disability is for both sections continues to be a challenge, and the myriad of issues with special ed disability continues to be a challenge, continues to be perplexing. Next slide. So when we look at it by race, again, we're supporting a majority of our families that are identifying as Black African American. We are, definitely not. We see underrepresentation in our white families and underrepresentation in our Latinx families, and this continues to be something that has occurred for the past couple of years, even though we have thrown more resources and put more supports and more efforts into engage in those communities. We just haven't seen the buy-in or the response that we would like. Next slide. So we look at, by race, special ed and enrollment access are leading the issues for our families that identify as Black African American. These are challenges that families present daily with us. Next slide. For our Latinx and our Spanish-speaking community, we have student safety was something that we saw and that was new for us compared to last year. Last year we saw a lot of issues with enrollment access, and this year that was replaced with student safety. There were several large incidents with students' transportation and student safety affecting communities in wards 4 and 1 this past school year. Next slide. Enrollment access for our families that identify as white, non-Hispanic is again by far the largest concern for those families. Next slide. And so one of the things that we noticed and we want to point out was, or just make sure is evident, is where our students are going to school and where our students live, and kind of how that looks like and how we get our calls. And so, again, 33% of our calls are coming from Ward 8 families, but it's only involving 22 of those. When we look at those calls, or when we look again at Ward 8 schools, they're only 22% of those calls are related to Ward 8 schools. That's same true for Ward 7, at 28% of our calls that are residents. And then when we look at the inverse of when we look at the school location, it's only 19% of those calls are related to Ward 7 schools. In some areas, we see the reverse, such as Ward 6, where 13% of those calls were related to the school. Schools were located in Ward 6, and 7% were related to to actual families residing in Ward 6. On to the next. So we saw some trends that we can kind of just point out and that we can share out. The majority of RFAs from Wards 3 and 8 originated with students who attended their in-boundary DC public schools. Majority of RFAs from Wards 5, 6, and 7 are in relation to DCPS schools that are out of their boundaries or at a campus in another ward. The majority of RFAs from Ward 4 concerned public charter schools, and the majority of RFAs from Ward 2 concerned DCPS elective and citywide schools. When we looked at some of the trends by ward of residents and by topic. Special ed disabilities is in the top 3 concern across all wards. Enrollment access is in the top 3 areas of concern across all wards except for Ward 6. And student safety is in the top 3 areas of concern across Wards 4, 6, 7, and 8. At the end of the deck in the assembly, you'll see all of your individual ward breakdowns. So there's wards 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8. Little breakdowns at the end of the deck if you want to look at your particular ward. Next slide. So when we look at our overall impact and what we did in 1920, we engaged with 3,284 people face to face. And out of that 3,284, engagements face-to-face, around 1,500 of those things occurred virtually. And that was hence our post-COVID interactions. The larger number that makes up that 7,942 are ways that we make sure our information and our guidebooks and physical resources got to parents. And so we know our go-to guide is printed in English, Spanish, and Amharic, as well as the discipline guide is printed in English, Spanish, and Amharic. The majority of our special ed resources is also printed in Spanish. And so we make sure we get those to our partners. And we spend a lot of time just making sure all of the libraries have some of our information available at least two to 3 times a year, as well as rec centers. On to the next. And so when you look at our public engagement data, specifically our face-to-face contact, 46% of those contacts are coming through in community engagement. So that's meeting folks, meeting stakeholders in the community. The other 24% are coming through solely parent and student engagement. So that's being activities or events that are at school buildings, or activity events that are specifically geared for parents. The other 14% are engaged with organizational stakeholders as well as government stakeholders. On to the next slide. This just breaks down kind of where we're meeting and how we're meeting, and what we're spending our time when we're not on the phone daily with our family. And as you see, we ramped up our engagement to stay active after COVID-19. So almost 90% of our virtual engagement efforts came after March. And so we've always prided ourselves in being in the community, kind of meeting folks where they are, regardless of the situation, and just showing up when asked. And so we continue to do that virtually. Next slide. So we're going to get into our recommendations. We had some recommendations are very similar to recommendations that we've had in the past. Others are new to this, new and kind of reflective of this year. Next slide. So one of the things that we've called for, even since my predecessor, Dr. Faith Gibson Hubbard, was increasing transparency on LEAs around special ed capacity. One of the things that we know is that parents just need more information on making these decisions. We've created guidebooks, we've created workshops, we've created a whole lot of resources to help parents to try to achieve this information, to get to this information, but there could be things that can be done on the other end at the LEA side that can make this information more accessible, more readily available. And so one of the things that we're really asking for is to making sure, and I think we did it during this recent COVID experiences, to make sure a point of contact for families that is expressly for special ed is available. That questions and concerns can be brought to. We would love to have that kind of put on the My School. That should be something that's listed on the My School DC platform, and it's something that it's something that it would make families a lot more confident in in the school building that they're choosing for the child. The next ask for this was also on kind of making sure our OST providers that are based in school buildings are ready to handle the students that are in school buildings. So if you may not know, if you do know, if you're an after school provider, your OST provider may or may not necessarily have the same capacity as your school. So if your school, it could be very likely that your whatever program or whatever activity that is happening after school, your child could be excluded because the accommodations that were available during the day are not available in the after school program in the afternoon. And so if school parent programs and OST providers could just list what they do have accommodations for, it would make it an easier way for parents to kind of figure out what steps could they take to provide for after school care and aftercare, and what steps they could take to make sure their student is engaged in some type of extracurricular activity.
And can I just ask how much longer there is? How many more slides?
We have 2.
Just 2? Okay.
So both of the slides are actually recommendations that are in that are in the annual report. So you can read them on your own. Again, on the next slide, we're calling for more teacher representation and information and data that can be shared publicly for that. And the slide after that, we're requesting for more mental health supports for students and families. I can take questions. Take questions now.
Any questions?
Thanks, Dan. Members, as we did previously, please do use the raise your hand feature, and we'll get through questions from everybody. Mr. Parker.
Thanks, Dan. I remain impressed by the breadth of your office's work, so thanks for all that you're doing. I'm trying to make a connection to what I heard in Serena's presentation and yours. You talked about the dyslexia guidebook and how you're working to inform parents of their rights as well as the diagnosis process. I'm also remembering Serena talking about how there's just a vast difference in how schools discuss these different diagnoses and the process. Like, what is your office hearing from parents as it relates to you trying to better educate and inform them about the specifics of things like dyslexia, but maybe not every school is equipped with the same language or resources? And like, how are you all grappling with that?
So I think specifically in terms of dyslexia, there is a very large gap of knowledge between parents and schools, as well as kind of a gap of knowledge of what's appropriate, what's IDEA appropriate, what's 504 appropriate for the school to provide for students that may have traits or signs of dyslexia. So there's a huge gap between what parents are getting from, parents that have the access and means to get an outside professional to say, this is the diagnosis and this is the resources and these are the steps to treat it, versus what schools can kind of come up with a solution. I think parents for the most part rely on what schools will tell them until they are informed of, there's another process to go about to navigating to getting to where you want to be.
Yeah, a quick follow up there. Yes, I would imagine that's a big gap. When a parent calls your office and let's say they are saying, your guidebook is really helpful. I talked to my school, but they're not giving me the information or they're not talking in the same language. Then what is your office response? Is it like, let me point you to legal professionals or other resources, or are you then passing them over to Serena's office to try to mediate the situation?
So in some situations, yes, we're making referrals to our partners. Serena's to the Ombudsman Office is one of them. AJE, CLC is another one. What we found with some diagnoses, especially dyslexia diagnosis, is that it's not explicitly noted in the IDEA as something that requires a school to take, a certain prescribed set of actions. And so we always encourage parents to, again, go to their health professional, their health practitioner, seek out that diagnosis and come back to the school and come back and request those independent evaluations and go through their whole rights and their whole IDA processes. And so that's going through the formal mediation through OSCE, if that's going through a formal, another informal mediation with Serena, or pursuing legal options, we always encourage parents to try those mediation options first.
Super helpful. It just seems like informing parents is one piece of the puzzle, but then also helping and supporting them through the process is like another major piece. Thanks.
Thank you. Dr. O'Leary.
Thank you, Dan. It seems to me that the information that you're giving is extraordinarily valuable, but that is there a way you can get the information, like put in something that you could put into a message to the students who are online every day? Just some kind of a commercial or something like that DCPS or the LEAs could put onto their program so that they could find out about both you and Serena's offices?
So
Because
this
I
year-
think there's a lot. I mean, this information needs to be shared with parents, but it just seems to me that there ought to be a way to share it virtually.
So this year we spent a lot of time on Instagram, and that is actually when we did our student survey, that is their preferred method of communication. So we run Instagram lives, we run Instagram podcasts, Instagram TV. We do a lot of things on Instagram. In addition to that, I think this year this is the first time we did radio ads, and we did radio ads in both English and Spanish. And so in those ads, we were able to keep and kind of send out to schools if they want to, run it in there and disseminate it through their process. As well as we have, most of our information is available in the DME's Wednesday circular. And so when they send out their newsletter, our information is when we have new stuff available, is included in that as well.
Because I know the secondary schools have homerooms. It would seem that you could put a quick 60-second ad to send them on, that the systems would put in to the virtual homerooms. I mean, I don't know too much about technology, and you're talking about Instagram, but I just, if people don't have Instagram, they don't get the information. But anybody that's on virtual learning,
I do think it's something we can look into. I would, I think that's something we can follow up. We can definitely follow with DCPS and follow up some of our other charter LEAs.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah.
Dr. Sutter.
Thank you. Thanks, Dan. This was incredibly comprehensive. One question I have about the recommendations. In the piece about making teacher diversity and retention data in DC's star rating framework, you do a nice job summarizing the issue around the lack of appropriate representation of teachers of color and how that relates to your work, and then the suspensions by students of color and how that connects to the disproportionality. And then you make a recommendation about including the data related to teacher diversity and retention in the STAR framework. I just had a question about, are there research studies that you would point us towards that show that having a representative teacher workforce leads to lower disciplinary infractions? Because I haven't seen that line drawn really clearly. I would agree that it makes sense to start to reason that way, but I haven't seen that line drawn clearly in research. And if you've done that research, I'd love to find out.
So we haven't, so there isn't, I'm not aware, to be perfectly honest, of any research that shows a direct connection outside of a correlation. That I don't think, I know there's some direct research that can point towards academic performance, but not necessarily that speaks towards disciplinary and exclusionary practices.
Got it. Okay. Thanks very much, Dan. I appreciate it.
Thank you. Members, are there additional questions? Seeing none, thank you so much, Dan. We really appreciate all your work. And please again, give our thanks to the incredible staff of the OSA who is tirelessly working to help all of our families. We really appreciate it. Next up on our agenda is our lovely friends from OSSE on the attendance regulations. Justin, do you want to lead your slides or do you want me to do it?
Sure, you do it.
Oh, good. Give me 1 second.
I'll outsource that. I've been in a very generous mood today, John Paul. You do it.
Great. Let me pull them up.
How is everyone? It's good to see you. I don't really have that much today, but I did want to get back with you and touch base about how we plan to proceed. on approving, on considering and hopefully approving the attendance regulations. Up front, our public comment is winding down. John Paul sent me some thoughts from the board. I've not had the opportunity to sift through a lot of those. Many of them I think that I think have been touched on in the past conversations. We've had, I think, at least 2 or 3 conversations on this proposal over the past several months. So I think just sort of glancing at the letter, I'm pretty familiar with some of those thoughts, and we're appreciative of those. And I think that we can think about how we are looking to go forward. Next slide, John Paul. So I just wanted to give you an update on our attendance regulation, and then in your packet, you should have gotten our first stab at the approval resolution. And then we will go through what we've done in the past since the last time I've seen you, and then next steps. Next slide, John Paul. Next slide. All right. So for your reference, I gave you hyperlinks here to all of our resources. So if you wanted to go back and look at what we've proposed and some of our supporting documents, these hyperlinks are here. So you'll see our guidance documents. You'll see our frequently asked questions. I think I mentioned this the last time we were together. This is a pretty comprehensive document that covers attendance in its totality beyond just the collection of attendance. So it should be a good primer on just sort of the underlying statute, on collection of attendance, and then other obligations such as reporting and interventions. You'll also see the link to our emergency and proposed attendance regulations. I know you got that the last time. I've also provided you with the link to our LEA continuous education plans. Those are all posted online for you to take a look at. We also put together a resource that took what we thought were exemplar answers in the continuous education plans and aggregated them into one document, and we shared that back with LEAs when we provided them with an update of our resources for continuous education. We thought that might be an easy lift tool to just sort of help people sort of look at what were stronger answers. And then you'll also see a link to our resources for local education agencies and then also educators. So next slide, John Paul. So next slide. So where do we go from here? In just a few days, on November 9th, our public comment will end. We have not gotten any public comments the last time I checked, which was sometime last week. I can't remember the exact date. And I am presenting to you our draft resolution tonight. You have a public meeting on the 18th. We imagine that would be the opportunity for you to take public comment consistent with your rules. December 2nd, you have another working session where we will come and have our final rulemaking language before you. We'll do another round of questions on what we're going out for final and for your approval. On the 16th, you have your public meeting, I believe, where we're going to ask you to vote on the attendance policy. Our emergency rulemaking expires on the 25th. And then if we get your approval, we'll move to our to promulgate the final rulemaking. So as far as usually where we go from here, I don't think with this particular board, we've really had a lot of sort of approvals, but the way that we've done it in the past has been, John Paul sent me the letter. I'll work with John Paul on responding to the letter and any next steps that we take on those. So I will reach out to him, and usually John Paul and I go back and forth on the resolution. Like he'll bring me some red lines and some edits, and we'll go from there. Are there any questions about process? John Paul, you can show my face again so I can see everybody. Okay, you're back.
Great.
You guys are veterans or tired. Were you up late last night?
I don't know why anyone would be up late.
I know. Go to bed. Okay.
I do see actually one question. Fraser, is that your hand from previous, or is this time?
No, that's now.
Okay, go ahead.
I have a question about the attendance rules that are being made in a state of virtuality, for lack of a better word. Is there any kind of a caveat as far as the rules because we don't know when schools are going to be functioning regularly at all. And attendance right now is a problem, I think. And I'm wondering if there's been any thought given to sort of alternative rules for special situations.
Special situations like what? Do you have a specific example?
Yeah, I really do. Because I know that right now the situation is when a student has up until 11:59 to register their attendance for the day. And I was wondering if was there anything done after the first advisory looking at the figures for actual attendance recorded compared with performance, with the grades that those students made. Because back when schools were open, if a student's attendance was really poor, then it was guaranteed that the student's grades were probably going to be really poor. And I'm just wondering if the fact that a student can, theoretically have perfect attendance and have no performance. Because you wouldn't think that a student, back in the day, who had perfect attendance would usually get a bad grade.
So it sounds, go ahead.
Say again?
Oh, were you done? Do you want me to respond?
Yes, please.
Okay. So I think you're referring to DCPS's policy when you mentioned 1159. So DCPS, they defined authentication. They defined what constituted engagement to be defined as present. That's what you defined, what you referenced there. We collect daily attendance from DCPS. We provide information back to them in dashboards like we do every year so they can manage their attendance. So we have a click application. We've talked about this before. That they can generate lists of students that have attendance issues, chronic absenteeism, truancy, anything. And we provide them with the dashboard and the analytics to use that. On the question of how that relates to their grading, OSSE doesn't do anything about grading. The state education agency, we don't collect student grades. So the follow-up and intervention, that would be a school level function. I think it's probably a really good idea for school leaders and teachers to think about the relationship between attendance and grading. I think if I had a child in school, I would ask that. It would be a very important question and that I would want an answer to. But that would be sort of the LEA in the school role. So that would be more of a particular DCPS question of their processes and systems. I don't know the answer to that.
Okay, one other question, and it's about LMS.
Yes.
And you know what my question is going to be because I talk to you about it all the time because there doesn't seem to be any kind of a regularity in different LMSs and different LEAs. Am I wrong about that?
So again, a learning management system is the platform of how a particular school system, it could be a school, it could be LMS is a term that's used outside of our context. It could be anybody that procures a learning management system, of how they're organizing their instruction and its functionality. We do not have statewide parameters around the procurement or selection of a learning management system. I believe that just in my skimming of the letter, the point that the board raised, I felt was a good point, which was about how if families were having problems with LMSs, how could, like, what are schools and LEAs doing to support them in doing that, right? And the additional services. So I think that I would be curious to hear if you have them, you can email me them or whatever. Like if you're having, if it's a specific, like, is it people having problems with Canvas? DCPS has contact information for people to go and get the support that they need. They also had some parent resources, like a parent training academy or something. I remember that to provide that type of support. Like that would be where they get it. But we do not have parameters around those instruction. Like that's an instructional resource. We didn't like schools and LEAs are able to make that decision for themselves. We don't have statewide parameters on those.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Gasoy.
Thank you. Good to see you, Justin.
Mhm.
Not late at all last night. Just kidding. I have two questions. So one is, assuming there is going to be a star rating this year, is attendance going to be part of that? Like, will schools be assessed based on their attendance? That's one question.
So I don't know. I don't know the answer to that. I don't believe that we've made any type of announcement regarding STAR. So I don't have that information.
Okay, so that's in the works.
I don't have that information. So I don't know the answer.
Okay. Second question, I think, is maybe building on Fraser's question. And I guess I appreciate, and I think we all appreciate sort of this balance that needs to be kept between providing LEAs with flexibility, both because of, the pandemic situation, and also to sort of reflect the differences in different kinds of LEAs. And sort of balancing that with the need to collect consistent and robust data that we can use, right, to understand what's actually happening, which I think is what Fraser's getting at. And just to give you an example, I have two clear data points. One is from speaking with a principal at length, and one is as being a parent in a charter school, and the principal was a DCPS principal. So what the DCPS principal told me is that students can log in the morning once, and that at the end of the day, that will automatically translate into being present, even if that student doesn't log in again, for other classes. And this is a dual language program. And one issue that has come up in that school is that some parents are just opting out of the Spanish language classes because they think it's too hard. And they're missing out on math then, because math is taught in Spanish. So that's just one issue. And I'm wondering, if I hadn't talked to that principal, I wouldn't know that. Are we collecting that kind of data? Because it seems important. And if not, what is the reason not to? Is it because it's too cumbersome? Is there another agency that should do that? So sorry, this is getting long-winded. I'm going to stop there.
Oh no, it's fine. It's a good question. So I think it sounds like, once again, you're describing DCPS's policy, and they did the two-part test. Like they had authentication and engagement. And remember when we first started this, I think I had a slide that was like attendance is, and like attendance is not, like exemplar, non-exemplar. One of those things was like, we want to make sure that we can authenticate a student's presence in some way, that we like have some way of like keeping up with students in a systematic way for child welfare type issues, right? And then the other thing was like, are they in a posture of education, right? Because think about it in person. A student could come into school, but not be engaged necessarily in their work, right? They might not turn in an exit ticket. They might not turn in an assignment. They might not do those things. And like we did not, it was not appropriate for us to sort of go into that deeper sort of like defining what the learning expectation for a student is in each individual period for every single LEA for across schools. We like there are like, that's an important question, but like the attendance policy is like, that's the attendance and beyond some things. So it sounds like a lot, like LEA should be using the information that is before them. They collect information that we collect and some information that we do not collect. If an LEA could have like timestamps, right? Like their sign on and sign off things. We do not, like that would be a massive amount of data for us to do everybody's time, like everybody's timestamp on like if they had an LMS that collected timestamps. We like that would be a real challenge. But some LEAs like that had that ability, and but they had that, like that's their job. It's their job to monitor student engagement around those things. And like I understand your concern that sometimes those things happen really well in some places and sometimes that they don't. But like that's like foundationally the school issue to be following up on those types of things.
Okay, I guess my thinking on this is that heaven forbid this continues, right? Like into year 2, or it happens again in the future. We want to learn from this experience, and just listening to that one conversation with that principal and just knowing what I'm going through as a parent is like hugely valuable. And then I'm like, gosh, what's happening in the other, however many, 198 schools. So I understand, like, I guess I'm just raising this as an issue. We need to learn from, it's one thing to be able to look at the continuous learning plans. It's another to really understand what's happening behind them, right? Like what this principal is describing is only like a small piece of what I learned about that, that's particular school community because of that particular programming that they have. And other issues around demographics. So I'm just putting it out there that if there is a way for us to capture that, and maybe that's not OSSE that does it, maybe it's a different space, it certainly would be worthwhile. So thank you.
Absolutely, I hear you on that. And I think something to think about is, remember this attendance policy is only for this year. We don't know what the future is going to look like. So we were like we are not writing an attendance policy into the future. We are not, we don't know what the future is going to look like. But I think it's important. And I think that it's a good question for leaders to be thinking about is not only how do we sort of dig the car out of the ditch, but what did we learn from putting the car in the ditch and then coming back out of it? So thinking about like good organizations do postmortems. Like we do postmortems at OSSE all the time, like when we do a release or something to like try to get better over time. You don't make the same mistakes twice. Plus, like there's going to be a set of things that from this distance learning experience that stay in education, that change education. There'll be a set of things that don't, but there'll be a set of things that do. And like, how do we discern what are the right things to stay and what are the wrong things to stay? Like, for example, when we were talking discipline bill reforms, maybe a year or two ago in the council, the idea of continuing education for students that were excluded was a major point of contention. Like that was a big part of the contention of the bill. Like, how do you continue, like when a kid is excluded, like keeping education on? Well, buddy, 2 years later after COVID, you've got, that's what we've been doing. We've been continuing education outside of the physical school building. So this is a place where I've tried to challenge and be thoughtful with some of our discipline people is like, how do we think about that? Like in-school suspension looks different and out-of-school suspensions should also look different in this new world order. And how do we sort of keep those things? So, I mean, I encourage you to sort of just keep the list of those sort of bigger type ideas as we come along out of them. I wish I could fix all of them today, but I can't. But yeah, I think that's you're thinking in the right direction there.
Thank you, Justin.
Mm-hmm.
Great. Dr. Sutter.
Thank you. Justin, my question is not about attendance. I actually had a question about social studies. So if others have questions about attendance. I want to make sure I don't interrupt the flow.
Okay. Other members, do you have questions about attendance? Great. Then go right ahead, Dr. Sutter.
Cool. Justin, I want to thank you and your team, especially Siobhan, for the really wonderful partnership you've offered us on social studies. We talked briefly about the upcoming information you're going to share with the CISAC. And I just wondered if you could preview the like super high points for my colleagues on the board, because our social studies report will come much later in the meeting. And I don't want to count on you deciding to stick with us for the next hour plus.
Yeah. Yes, I can speak to that a little bit. So remember, like several months ago, we said that we wanted to start this journey on revisiting our social studies standards, and we worked with John Paul and Jess to sort of come up with sort of a framework of how we would proceed. And you all formed an advisory committee of stakeholders, and then we would do sort of the technical writing piece. And you are in the process of providing us with parameters, with guideposts for how we should think about the revising, the rewriting, and to what extent we should do those things, right? And we've been participating. Me and Siobhan have been attending and listening, and then we've also been meeting to sort of synthesize after those meetings. Next Tuesday, right?
Yes.
Next Tuesday, Siobhan and I will present on sort of how we're thinking about the writing committee. So thinking about the composition and their charge. We've spent money on this. Like we have a contractor that's done this work with other states to help us sort of facilitate these like really in-depth writing process. It's going to be a lift. It is a pretty significant time commitment for people, and we want to make sure that people sort of understand like we're looking and we're trying to find people to help us out. We'll have a sample application and provide the advisory committee with some background information and give us some feedback on how to think this. We want to get the application out in December because we're asking people to show some more technical expertise. Like this is not necessarily like I really care about civics, but I'm not really taught civics. Like this might not be your baby, but this is like, we're asking people to like talk about a standard that needs revised. If you have a lesson where you've taught a DC standard in social studies, could you provide your lesson plan for that to like help us find good people? So it's an application that we think will take people some time, and we want to try to get that out and get those back in January so we can begin to get started and get set up in February, because there's going to be some onboarding. There's going to be and we've also started procuring resources, our contractors. So we want to make sure that we can hit the ground running and do what we said we were going to do. I think like we wanted to make sure that we got this done by what year? 2022. What year is it? 2020.
Yeah.
We wanted to make sure that we got done in the next 2 years, and like by the time we do this advisory piece and we take the next year to do this writing piece, and we come back to the advisory committee and then do public engagement, and then do like, we're going to be really up on some time to sort of hit where we want to go. So yeah.
Thank you, Justin. I really appreciate that. I know that I got to hear it, and I'll make sure I collect questions from members later. If you have time now, it looks like maybe Ruth might have a question, but I really appreciate you sharing that. And I want to, again, on the record, really appreciate the partnership OSSE has engaged in with this, because this is big work, and it's not for the faint of heart, and it means a lot for the children of DC that we're engaging in this work, especially in the moment we're all living through today.
Was there another question?
Actually, my question is back on the attendance regs, but let me say one thing on social studies, which is just, that's great that you have a contractor. I know we were all going to try to get staffing for this task force, and the pandemic kind of interfered with that. So I appreciate the effort on your part to put something together. It'll be great. My question is just to go back to the point Emily raised. So I get you guys don't yet know what's going to happen on the star rating. I imagine part of that depends on what's going to go on at the education department. But can you tell us anything in terms of a timeline on that, and who has to decide, and what, if anything, might be going on in terms of that?
I can't. I don't have that information.
I guess, Justin, part of what I mean, do you know if somebody does, or just that it just isn't on the screen yet and nobody knows?
So
I don't have that. I don't have that information.
Thank you.
Yep.
great. Other questions on attendance regulations? Great. Thank you so much, Mr. Tooley. We really appreciate, as always, you joining us.
Thank you.
Members, we will shift to our next item on our agenda, which is related to reopening. President Wattenberg, do you want to lead this discussion?
Yeah, so we've got a couple of things that we're trying to do in here, actually three. One is, insofar as people want to give reports about sort of brief issues in their wards, questions, that's part of what we want to do. A second thing that we want to do, which could be related to the issues, is to hear ideas about how we want to deal with this at the November public meeting. And then the third is, you all got a draft of a letter to be sent from, many of us about reopening. And the original draft, as you recall, was before the reopening was delayed, and it sort of acknowledged a number of problems that we have all heard from our constituents. Once the reopening was delayed, I redrafted it to account for that, sort of reviewed what some of the problems were, and called for the time for the delay to really be used for very serious planning, so that we're not back in this situation. And in particular, that some of that planning be based on sort of school-based conversations, school-based development of plans that recognize the particular needs and possibilities in that school. So I got some comments back from, I believe, Emily, Fraser, and Jessica, which I have mainly incorporated into another draft, which you do not yet have, but I want to get any other input on this, and then I'll put that into a final draft. The main additional points on it were, well, like I said, we talk about having the school-based plans. I've added something about possibly the council being able to make some funding available for specific needs of specific schools. So if you're a school that feels like it can bring people back in an outdoor situation, but you need funding for outdoors, that would be the kind of thing there might be a special appropriation for. Another might be, here's a student that really can't take in a lot virtually, ADD or something else, so is really, really having problems at school keeping up. At the same time, isn't somebody, I think this was an example Jessica gave, isn't somebody that for all kinds of reasons is able to go in person. Maybe there's, that student has underlying conditions, or the family does. So maybe there's some kind of tutoring service, or anyway, the idea is to create some funding for particular kinds of needs that schools might have around this. So that's really what I'll say about that. So I'm going to open it up for comments. I think I'm just going to take them on any and all of those things, because they all kind of relate. So,
Dr. Kasoy.
Thank you. So I did get confirmation about the fact that the care classrooms are not, it's still not entirely clear if they are really postponed. And I heard from my principals that they were told that they are not postponed. It's just that they're going to be fewer staff reassigned. And so I think that needs to be really, I think that's in the letter, Ruth, is it? Okay, so specifically the input I got from principals was that it's just so obvious that they should have only staff who will do this voluntarily. and not just staff from other schools, obviously. So to find appropriate adults who want to be there, and to pay hazard pay, which I know we don't have that. So that was the recommendation. I don't know if we want to include that. And to make it collaborative within the feeders. And that was something that I think actually has been negotiated and maybe is going to happen, but we may want to also emphasize that. But I think most importantly is that this happens in collaboration with the secondary principals, the middle and high school principals, that it cannot happen as a mandate.
Let me just make one comment. I'll do a little back and forth with people so I can use this to create something better. Is at least part of the idea, I hear about the, we definitely don't want them taking teachers from other classes, other schools, but we also talked about possibly collaborating with nonprofits, after school programs. I think you've in the past raised museums. So it's not just DCPS staff at this.
Right. That if you, but I think the underlying point is collaborate with, I guess, yeah, I mean, it also, you're right. So doing both, collaborating with the middle and high school principals to see what's feasible there, but also looking beyond that, right? Looking at all the resources that are being underutilized, I assume right now. We could be wrong about that, but what are like the museum educators doing right now? What are the library staff who normally work with school groups doing right now? What is DPR, staff who would normally be doing after school programming? All of those folks, what are they doing? Can we utilize them? They have experience working with elementary age children. And those are also spaces that could be used. That may be also something to recommend, is that, because I think the emergency was that staff were being taken from schools where they were desperately needed. On the other hand, the elementary school principals I spoke to were also concerned because of the number of adults and students who would be in the building. They don't love this idea either, for the most part, as far as I can tell. So if there were a way to thin it out so that there were fewer care classrooms in elementary schools, that would be good too, if they could be in other settings that are being underutilized right now.
Okay. Very good, noted. Anything more on you? Should I?
Dr. Sutter?
Yeah, thank you. And I want to say thanks in advance to President Wattenberg for engaging with me on the phone today about some comments I'd put in the letter. I appreciate the discussion. So a couple things. One, what I've heard from Ward 6. So first, serious concerns from parents and community members about the lack of engagement on the front end with teachers in schools, with leaders at schools, with community members, with parents themselves about what their needs and concerns are now. Lots of surveys, lots of engagements have been done over the course of the COVID crisis, but the timing of that information as our knowledge of this pandemic has evolved, as people's work and home situations have evolved, folks were very concerned on two fronts. One, that the district was working with outdated data and made decisions with not the most up-to-date information. And two, the fact that the failure to engage the people closest to the work, teachers and leaders and parents, and rather announcing to them what had been decided on their behalf without their involvement throughout the process, is something that folks are very upset about. That, however, is in tension with serious concerns about virtual learning. Virtual learning does not seem to be going very well for most folks I'm hearing from. Technical aspects are part of that, but I'm hearing from a lot of early childhood parents of preschoolers, kindergartners, first graders in particular, whose children have little to no experience with school, who are not developmentally fulfilled in their educational growth or daily engagement by being online. And, it's just not working. Preschool online is not a thing for a reason. And so that's been a real concern. The CARES classroom setup doesn't help that. So having children come in person to do virtual learning doesn't fix virtual learning still being hard for 3, 4, and 5-year-olds. The other thing that I heard from families is that there are some folks who are struggling with the consistent changes and just want DCPS to come up with a plan that they can tell people about and implement now. So while there is a desire for engagement that's in tension with folks who are counting on in-person learning to be able to return to work. And I heard one story from one family at a school that a teacher at a nonprofit educational setting lost their job because they were counting on their child returning to in-person learning at DCPS, made plans for their job in that way, and now can't count on that. And so had to leave their job. So I think there's a bunch in tension, and that leads me to the things I'm going to say next. I was going into like sort of letter by letter pieces of the letter that I wanted to comment on, but here are the 2 things that I hope this letter centers, and I worry that at the moment it might not. The focus on returning to school being on the students. What do our students need? What do we want for our students, and how do we center the plan around them? Even as we recognize that we need the teachers, we need the administrators, we need the other school staff to feel safe and to feel engaged in the process. But the plan can't start with that. The plan has to center on what's right for students and then incorporate as the next circle out, how do we make that safe and doable for staff? How do we make that safe and doable for faculty? This is my perspective. The second is this equity need. If we say, let's have schools and school-based communities make plans, how do we keep equity at the center? How do we ensure that some schools with more capacity, whether that be from the PTA or the broader community, aren't able to plan something more comprehensive than schools that might not have that same sense of capacity or same additional access to space or funding? So here are the 2 tensions I see are really a big job, which is autonomy and equity. How do we allow school communities to make plans that are right for them while holding constant this belief about equity and putting students first? And how do we put forth a desire for autonomy, but also some level of consistency? I don't know how we create consistency for a commonly, collectively bargained teacher workforce, even as we allow autonomy at the building level. And all this lands me with this. We're trying to make a reopening plan for a school system that we do not oversee. And so I hope that our letter doesn't get too deep into do this, don't do that, yes, this, not that, but rather calls for a constant engagement of the folks who have to do the work, of a call for students to be centered in the plan, and a call for equity to be centered in the plan. So that's where I'm landing on our letter, which is, I think we've put a lot of things into it, and I am not opposed to many of them being in there, but I just hope that those 3 things are crystallized, that it's about the students, that the engagement of the people doing the work matters, and that we have to keep equity at the center. And we try not to over-engineer the process beyond that. So that's my 2 cents. And I do still hope to be able to sign on to the letter. So I'm sorry that I'm landing on that in this way, but let me know how I can help make those 3 things part of the center of what we say.
Thank you. Mr. Parker.
I'll be brief, but I just too would echo centering students. I think that is a compelling point. I think much of the discussion around reopening has been we either re-enter school buildings at scale or not, and students stay at home. And I think there is a world of opportunities that perhaps all entities should explore. And so I would just recommend our letter touching on that, whether that's learning hubs, whether that's different strategic opportunities to get students services while still honoring the perspectives of parents and educators who may not be comfortable going back into school buildings. I would echo everything that has already been said in terms of what I'm hearing from residents. In particular, I would just highlight parents with students with special needs. I've heard heightened concern from most recently, and something Serena said earlier really resonated, that they really just want a reprieve, even if that means someone coming into their house. I literally had a Ward 5 neighbor say, like, if I could just have a tutor come in my house. And this is a parent that's concerned about COVID, but I think that just speaks to the relief that they are desperately wanting, both for their kids, knowing that their kids are suffering, not getting the services that they need, but also, again, just speaking to like this need for us to think outside of the box. And I don't want our letter to be go into buildings or not go into buildings, would just be the point I would draw.
Thank you. Are there additional comments from members? Ruth, go ahead.
Let me just respond while nobody else has a hand up, I don't think, is, so to me, this issue of there's a world of options in between going back and not going and doing nothing. To me, that is what I'm trying to get at with this school-based thinking and planning, because different kids and families need different things and different staff are positioned to provide different things. So you could have schools that have special ed teachers that can go out, or special ed teachers that can receive kids in, and you might have others where you don't have that. So which is where you sort of then have to have this option of, there might need to be, some funding for some outside tutors or some outdoor space, but to the kind of the tension, I would say, between Zach and Jessica, what I would aim for is something that tries to get at the autonomy, but that the autonomy is in service of trying to find ways to deal with this very difficult time in ways that are respectful of the different needs of different people. And that both keeps us away from the do this, do that, which I don't think we want to get into, except in these very general ways of, the virtual learning can't be sacrificed for other kids going to school, because so many people are going to stay in virtual learning for a really long time, et cetera. So that's what I would aim for and hope that it would reach that balance that Jessica is hoping for.
Thank you. Madam President, I also want to note that there were some additional comments in the chat, so I'll make sure that those get to you as well.
Yes, yeah, please do. Thank you.
Absolutely. Were there additional parts on the reopening conversation that you wanted to hear, other than just hearing from members?
Yeah, and let me just say, I'm just looking at Jessica's chat about how complex it is to get this right for everyone, and that's exactly right. It is this, everybody is so different in this, and trying to figure out some ways to accommodate it. It's not going to be perfect, but at least try and then come up with something, to the point that Jessica made, that you've tried out with people, so you can pull it off. And then I'll just say one thing about what I'm getting back, I would say most of all from Ward 3 is, it's sort of hard to know. And I guess one thing that is, I still don't get is why we don't have a good survey from DCPS about how many families want to go back and where, and if it's different. My sense is probably roughly half absolutely don't want to go home, go back to school. Maybe a little bit less absolutely don't want to go back to school. Maybe quarter to a third really want to, and the others could be enticed to come back if the situation was right. But what is almost universal among those who would like to return and those who would not is, the planning and the lack of engagement and people, and it's put everybody into such a terrible, terrible position, and we can't do that again. So. What about thinking about our next meeting, which will be mid-December, 2 weeks from now.
November 18th.
November 18th, thank you. Are there experts, panelists that people would like to have to come talk about particular issues related to this?
Madam President, do you want me to talk about the idea that I had?
Yes, please do, Dumpo.
Okay. So members, one of the things that I had thought about, and this is in discussions with Serena and Dan and other members as well, is we have been working on some of the issues related to special education for a while, for many months, even pre-COVID. But one of the things that that was featured tonight in the presentations by the student advocate and by the ombudsman is the impact of reopening on students that are in our special education systems. And so I thought having a panel discussion, maybe with a couple parents, maybe some school leaders, maybe someone from OSSE's Special Education Council, to come and talk to us about what the experience has been, what they've seen, what things we can look at and continue to work on. And I think this goes to the additional piece of somewhat of what Justin was saying related to the discipline things. If there are things that we can do with our special education students when they can't be in a classroom, then we should investigate those and find out what they are and see if they work. It's not going to be the same universally, certainly, but for some students, this may be a really great opportunity for them. And so I think this is part of the conversation is maybe focusing our November discussion of reopening on the special education piece. But we wanted to check with you to see if it was a good idea. I'm seeing some head nods, so that makes me feel good. But if there's other ideas or things that we can look at, we're certainly open to that, I think. Ruth, is that clear enough?
Yeah, no, that sounds great. The other thing that I would potentially be interested in is if we could identify somebody who could talk to us about, how district schools have tried to accommodate either in the COVID space, which would be great, or in something else, this idea of being able to give schools a lot of discretion while also having parameters that respect the fact that there's equity needs, there's staff needs, and so on. So if we could find someone who could talk about that, that would be very useful. But I very much like the special ed focus. I think that's right on target. And the only thing I would say to that is I think there's a few, there's sort of the getting services piece, which has been a big problem. Is it in person? Is it not in person? What if, some I think are more readily provided not in person and some aren't. How is that being figured out? How should it be figured out? And then there's this issue, Jessica raised it in terms of the early grade kids of the just virtual doesn't work. And virtual doesn't work for kids with ADD. Virtual doesn't work for, there's a whole, groups of kids for which it just plain old doesn't work. And, and many of these are also students who aren't in a position to return to school. So I don't know what the solution is, but I think for some people they can. That's why we talk about them being a priority. But beyond that, do those people want to be in school all the time or part-time? And maybe to understand a little bit better about how the special education people could, the special education staff can provide, what needs to be virtual, what can't be, and so on. Those are just like aspects of this broader thing, which I think would be great to focus on.
Ruth, can I just speak to that for a second? It does seem that if individual schools are able to have some autonomy in the plans that they come up with, and DCPS started this, right? Like they allowed a limited number of schools to submit plans and actually start doing them. And that was another disruption that was so odd. It's like they're 3 weeks into this or something. But if school communities tend to have a better idea of which students need what. And if they have the leeway to be creative and maybe have some of their, their special ed team work with students at the library or in, like some of my Ward 1 schools, well, the one that is doing the special, was early in having their own plan, has a student support center. So they know which students needed to come in. And that does seem to be the key. And it's what Jessica was talking about, which is having real conversations with schools and school leaders around what makes sense, right? I think it's fine to float ideas that then are shown to not really make a ton of sense, but then, I guess what I'm trying to get at is if there were real conversations going on, some of the ideas that were put forward in term 2 plan would not have, I think it would have been clear that they should not be proposed, right? So I don't know. I guess I agree with Jessica that maybe we really just need 3 points. And the main point is communicate with the people who are doing the work, because that's where it all begins. If you're not doing that, it's a non-starter. That's all I want to say. Sorry, I was rambling, but that's what I wanted to get to.
I'll just jump in with 2 things. I think the special ed focus is a great idea. I know of a few schools that have been doing some pretty good work with special ed in virtual learning, and I'm happy to share the LEA names with John Paul and team to see if anyone from those schools might be willing to come speak. Because I think getting a clear picture from both parents, but also how schools have tried to deliver services virtually, where it seems to be going well from the perspective of school, student, and teacher. School, student, and parent. The second thing is, to Emily's point, the only other thing I think might be interesting, and I don't want to extend, too many panels, but there are a few charter LEAs that seem to be doing some good work around the way they're constructing, bringing slightly larger groups of students back. Friendship comes to mind. I had a conversation with them about the work they did to have learning hubs in place for the first term. Now they're expanding those learning hubs in the second term, and what that means for the COVID testing they've been doing and are extending. So if it's possible to find a way to invite them, I might just encourage us to look at that. I'm sure there are other LEAs in that bucket as well, but Friendship, being the 3rd largest LEA in the city, comes to mind as something that might have practices more easily scaled or transferred to an LEA like DCPS, where there are just lots of moving pieces and all grade levels pre-K-12. So I did ask the folks that I spoke with there, Ken Cherry, their chief of staff, if I could mention the great work they're doing around COVID testing. And he said they'd have some more public info to share later this week, but might be good to just reach out to them and see if they'd be willing to come talk about that work.
And the one other just suggestion in that same direction is, to talk to one of the national special ed organizations about what they're sort of figuring out. They must at this point be developing, sort of figuring out ways to do this that work and don't work. So that would be very interesting. Anybody else on this? Going once. All right. That brings us to committee reports.
Madam President, if I could interject for a second, I did want to note that I did get a note from Alex O'Sullivan that he was not going to be able to be here tonight. He had lots of schoolwork and also was up a little bit later than originally intended yesterday. I do also have a report for the Teacher Retention Committee on behalf of Dr. O'Leary, who had to step off to attend an ANC meeting this evening. Let me know if should I go ahead with that?
Yeah, what I would say to all of us, everybody use their discretion, and if you have something that must take a fair amount of time, that's fine. But in light of, I think everybody was up so late last night, I think the shorter the reports, the better tonight.
Sorry, I had to wave.
Hi, Frankie.
And Frankie, yeah. So for teacher retention, I wanted to give everyone an update really quickly on the hearing that we had on our bill 23-0515 on the statewide Data Warehouse Amendment Act. I thought the support that we got from the community around the purpose of the bill, I thought was really strong. I do think I want to note specifically for everyone watching in the public that the record for that hearing is still open. So if you do have additional comments related to the bill, please feel free to send those on to the DC Council related to that bill. And the hearing record will be open until November 6th at 5 p.m. And I know Ruth and I have both done some follow-ups with some of the members of the council asking for next steps and those types of things. And I'm sure we'll be back with the board to discuss those next steps as soon as we hear a little bit of additional information. And the other thing that I wanted to talk about too is that the Teacher Retention Committee had recommended that the state board explore the idea of a teacher council similar to the Student Advisory Committee. And I want to thank our policy fellow Rachel for doing a lot of the groundwork on this. But we're working on some ideas and potential options on how that might work and how that might work in a long-term strategy. And so at the next teacher retention meeting or committee meeting, we'll discuss those potential options. And Madam President, that's it for teacher retention.
Okay, we're going to skip student advisory. I think that's fine. Okay, social studies, Jessica.
Sorry, I was looking at the social studies documents I wanted to share in links. So you heard the first update, which I wanted to share and see if there were any questions. And that was from Justin. He and Siobhan have devised a really comprehensive process to present to the SISAC on Tuesday night about how they're going to recruit the writing committee. They're looking for roughly 30 to 35 educators willing to dedicate a significant chunk of time beginning in February of 2021, sort of loaded into the summer months, obviously when teachers have more time for professional development, et cetera, and aiming to cover a significant number of the LEAs in town in their recruitment. So the SISAC will get the full deck and details on that on Tuesday night, and we'll make sure that that's all sent to the board at the same time that the SISAC gets it. But that was one update. So I'll pause there if there are any questions. Then I have two more updates for you all. Cool, easy. Second is I had sent a memo to the committee and CC'd all the members of the board that just outlines the timeline from now until our December public meeting, when we're hoping to vote on the guiding principles that the SISAC will have done by that point. They will also have undergone public comment by that point. And we'll be talking about that public comment process with the SISAC on Tuesday night. Need access. Can do that. Sorry, Emily. But I wanted to make sure that folks didn't have any questions here or any concerns that they wanted to raise, just so that we are all on the same page and folks feel good about the timeline and where we're headed.
So I just want to note that I know, I guess Zachary and I don't know about others, gave you some comments to be included in what goes back into the SISAC. So I guess that'll all start playing out next week.
You've got the third update. That's the third update.
Okay.
I'm just making sure everyone can access this because it looks like for some reason maybe folks can't. So I just added Ruth, Marcus, and Zachary and Frazier. Okay, something's weird with the document. I'm not sure why it's not letting me share, but okay. I think people were able to get it.
Where?
The link is in the chat.
Okay.
Yeah, it looks like Emily's in. Being weird about sharing settings. So John Paul, is it easier if I just share my screen?
Sure. 1 second. Actually, I can't do that. So give me 1 second. Maybe I can share my screen.
No worries. There looks like me.
Oh, now you might be able to.
Let's try.
I'm in.
Cool. I can share my screen and then people should be able to see it. So this is the timeline. It basically, I love a good backwards planning. So we had the CISAC meeting early in October. This memo was generated out of the Social Studies Committee meeting, which happened right thereafter. And this is what we said would happen. The Social Studies Committee members and all SBOE members were invited to provide feedback on the draft of the guiding principles. And I did get feedback from both Zachary and Ruth, and I'll talk about how we've incorporated that in just a moment. I didn't get feedback from anybody else, but certainly if folks have thoughts, happy to hear them out and see what we can do to make sure the CISAC can consider that before next Tuesday. Or I'm sorry, in anticipation of Tuesday's meeting. We are going to have the meeting for the CISAC on November 10th, where they'll review the state board's input on those guiding principles and come to a final draft of the guiding principles. Later that week, we're going to put those guiding principles out for public comment. And we've got a proposal we're bringing to the CISAC on how to do that. Basically, we want to make it as easy as possible for members of the public to highlight their agreement with using the guiding principles or their concerns about, with minimal sort of writing required, so that we can quickly tabulate people's feedback and get it out to both the CISAC and the board. We have our working session on December 2nd, when the state board will get the final draft of those CISAC guiding principles and an assembly of all the public feedback we got on them. And then we'll have time as a board to pull together questions and comments for the CISAC. Their meeting is on the 9th. We'll send any of their questions back to the board with their final set of guiding principles in a resolution form. And the hope is that we can vote on a resolution to advance those guiding principles to OSSE at our December 16th public meeting. One last thing I'll say, because it is a tight timeline. It's the same timeline we've been working with since the beginning. I think now it just feels the scope and weight of what we're doing at this work. But the second thing is, these guiding principles are what this writing committee Justin mentioned will use to guide their work. So getting them to them at the start of their work in January matters a great deal. So I do hope we can get together and get these voted on at the December meeting so that they can hit the ground running and be informed by what we've learned. Because I don't want there to be any question that the writing committee is working with the input the board gives them. Okay, if you have thoughts on the timeline that come up when we all get a good night's sleep tonight, please let me know and send them my way. You all will have access to this document. The other thing I thought I would share while I was here is what these guiding principles now look like. So Ruth and Zachary, what I did was took the great memo you sent me and used it as a proposed preamble. This is something that members of the CISAC actually asked about. They said, well, couldn't we have some sort of header text that made sure the guiding principles were given context? So I took a few liberties with adding in a sentence here or there, but it is your memo put in as a preamble that we're going to ask the CISAC to engage with. One wording change that I'd actually just ask for your feedback on, you and Zachary wrote in this last bullet point here, the subsequent unequal treatment of African Americans and other non-white groups. In our CISAC conversation, it's come up a few times, not using white as a reference group, but rather thinking of another term. The term minoritized is one used in a text I work on with my graduate students on social justice leadership. And so I offered that as a substituted language, but if folks have other ways we might talk about this concept, which is basically like dealing with groups that have not been centered in history, maybe that's another way we can put it. I'd be open to that. So that's one question. The other thing I wanted to let you know is that we also took any sort of text-based comments. Zachary, you made some nice comments in the guiding principles and pulled those into the cleaned up text. You can see I haven't finished accepting all of Alex's good comments. So some of those are right there in the document. And I am having ongoing conversations this week with members of the SISAC who raised questions about language in here. So you'll see like Emily, Becca, and Barbara had questions about proposed guiding principle 9. We have phone calls tomorrow and Friday to get input, work through this language with members of the SISAC, and then we'll send it out to everybody on the SISAC and the Social Studies Committee on Friday. So this draft is the combined efforts of Ruth's feedback, Zachary's feedback, members of the SISAC's feedback, and my efforts to clean up some overly wordy or inconsistent language. And this is what the SISAC will be using on Tuesday to reflect on, work towards final consensus on places where things are highlighted in red and consensus had not been reached, or decide we can't get to consensus. And so that will go either as a things we talked about but did not agree to make principles list, or may get thrown out because the group decides that we've tackled it well enough elsewhere. So that was my long-winded, I will send links to both of these to folks, but that is my update. Any questions or comments?
I would just say it's really exciting that things are getting this close to being finalized, and it's such an important project. So I hope you're feeling as excited as
I have the excitement nausea kind of feeling. So I think it's a good feeling, but it is exciting. And I will say, I have to thank all of you for the really wonderful engagement in picking the members of the SISAC, because y'all pick winners. We have a wonderful set of people who have just engaged in really thoughtful ways, including pushing back when things were not headed in the right direction. And so I think it's been a really good process. And I got the chance to speak with one of our SISAC members today, and she said pretty similar stuff, that she was just glad that this was a genuine process and that she felt really deeply engaged in it. And that made me really proud to hear that we all pulled together to make a group that did that work.
yay. So
And Emily, I actually like your language a lot, so I think I might put that in there and we'll see how that works for folks.
Oh, I think you said that. I was just saying I like what you said. The groups that have not been centered.
This is how I probably need to get more sleep tonight.
Yeah, you said that. I was like, yeah.
Wow, that sounds so good, Emily. Oh, apparently I said it.
Oh, well.
Are there additional questions for Dr. Sutter?
No, just to say that don't get too excited. It's the end of the beginning, I think.
Oh, yes. Oh, yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
but it is great to see the end of the beginning approaching. So, oh, I'm sorry, I was going to go well-rounded. Sorry.
So we had our first webinar in a series, and it went really well. So I don't know how much detail I'm going to go into, but we started with 6 panelists we were going to have, and we kind of were going against the advice we had gotten from some experts because we just couldn't whittle it down. But in the end, one person canceled, and I don't know what, we never got the actually 6 persons. So 4 was the magic number. It was such a good conversation. And just to remind you, it was focused on school parent or school family engagement and partnerships. And the reason why I'm emphasizing families is because one of the panelists was a grandparent, and she's one of the grandparents who helped to start the building that's downtown for grandparents who are raising children. So she was very powerful, had a really powerful voice, and just added a really important perspective. We had 2 principals, one from Ward 1 and one from Ward 8. Principal Morales from Bancroft and Principal Riddlesberger from Ketchum. And then a parent from Thompson Elementary in Ward 2. And it just was a very honest and we were able to get pretty deep with 4 panelists. So I think that's kind of one of the takeaways that we came away with is the smaller the panel, the better you can actually have a real conversation. And we have our next meeting on Friday, and we'll discuss some ideas for the next topic. So I think this was a good learning experience. Our only downside, I think, was that we didn't have many people attend. And I think it was a combination of the timing with reopening stuff. And then also there was a glitch with the link, I think. So we're working all of that out. Oh, another great thing, and then I'll end, is we are now using Zoom, and we have simultaneous interpretation capabilities, which is awesome. So we were actually able to record in both languages, and we're going to set up a platform where we'll be, keeping the recordings in English and Spanish, and also resources that get mentioned during the webinars, so people can have that as a resource. So anything?
Emily, can I interrupt one quick second related to the translations thing? So this is a new feature that we have on Zoom. So we can do this for, and I'm saying this now for the public as well, that if we do need to have the translation available for any of our meetings, just contact the state board as early as you can prior to the meeting, and we will do our best to make sure that that translation is set up for whatever language that is potentially needed. So it's a really great opportunity for us to be able to offer access to our meetings to our public that doesn't have English as a first language.
Yep. Thank you, John Paul. That's a really good point. Anything else?
Yeah, I have one quick thing. So I was not able to come partly because of the glitch, and partly I then had a conflicting meeting, but I want to see it. And so this is so one, John Paul, I was wondering, can you send the link out to everybody so that we can encourage board members to watch it? And then related to that is, I haven't seen it, but is it the kind of thing that we could promote the link for people to look at, to let them know what's on there and that this is a resource to go to? Okay, so I think we should really do that.
Absolutely. And that was the idea behind creating a platform, or, I mean, I guess it's just I don't know how it's going to work, but it'll be on our website, the SBOE website, and there'll be a section for well-rounded education where we keep the recordings and also related resources. So yeah, we should promote that. And actually there's a blog post. Oh geez, today we were supposed to do that, Zach. Yeah, so there's supposed to be a blog post on this coming out too, which is part of the promotion.
All right. Okay, so I'm going to be super quick. We did not have a research committee meeting last month. We have one next week. We'll be focusing in part on our upcoming survey of teachers, especially around COVID-related issues, but also around some curriculum and especially some reading, remediation, intervention, IEP issues, all of which we really had planned to do and worked out to a large extent last spring, but then had to delay because of the budget changes due to COVID. So we'll be looking at that. And gosh, I feel, John Paul, like there's one other big thing, which I am totally not remembering. Or maybe it was just that. Oh, and I know, and it was to discuss more generally this issue of being able to do more surveying. That's what it was. So that we're in a position to do that more often, more regularly on all kinds of issues that come up. So that is all I have. John Paul, anything from administrative, or I mean, Marcus, sorry.
What?
Can you hear me now?
Yes, can I just say Marcus looks like he's out of some great black and white movie. There's something about the color has come, it looks.
Yeah, I don't know what's going on with my lighting today. So, no, good evening, everybody. Nothing big from the admin committee other than I know that we discussed as leadership earlier this week that there are probably some, again, pretty tough considerations budgetarily that we're going to have to think about moving into the new year. And thinking about how we prioritize some of our spending with an even bleaker economic outlook for city government overall. So I know that we're working on, and John Paul in particular is working on some recommendations about what we can do, but undoubtedly they're going to be tough either way. And so just wanted to say that to prepare all of us for that discussion moving forward. Yeah, John Paul, if you want to say anything.
Yeah, I just wanted to remind again the members of the admin committee that we will be meeting tomorrow at 11 a.m. And so we will report out from that. So make sure that that's on your calendar as well.
Cool. That's it for me.
Okay, some new business, and I think Fraser might have some. You're back, Fraser. That's a real person behind that name. Nope, maybe not. I know Fraser went out and then he was going to try to come back. All right. That will wait until next time then. Okay.
Ruth, if I could just, it's less new business and something I would hope that we can consider in the next few months. Ruth and I discussed it, but just knowing that the Department of Ed, and I know given all of our recent elections, that may be changing, but the expectation currently is that the Department of Ed is still expecting states to offer some type of assessment strategy or plan. And I think that might be something we as a body discuss alongside IC, or at least to figure out what alternative plans there may be for the coming school year, as I know that will be top of mind for a lot of schools. So just putting that on people's radar if it's not already.
All right. Anything else? Okay. Motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Okay. See y'all, get a good sleep.
I love the gavel, Ruth.
My husband got it for me. Bye.
Bye.